That is the part most people missed. The cameras were locked on southern Japan. Alerts were flashing across television screens. Phone notifications were buzzing. People were watching live footage from Kyushu as buildings cracked, roads split, and evacuation warnings spread across coastal communities after a powerful earthquake struck near Kumamoto. For a few tense hours, the entire Pacific seemed to hold its breath. And while that was happening, while the headlines were filled with Japan and the world was refreshing for tsunami updates and casualty numbers, California was sending out its own quieter message. Not one giant apocalyptic message, not one movie scene rupture tearing the state in half. Something more subtle than that, and maybe because it was more subtle, more dangerous to ignore. A pattern, a rhythm, a reminder. The ground in California was moving again, in the north, in the south, and in one of the most crowded urban corridors in America. And if you only looked where everyone else was looking, you would have missed the fact that one edge of the Pacific was in crisis while the other was clearing its throat. That is what makes this story so unsettling. It is not really about a single earthquake. It is about attention. It is about how the world tends to fixate on the loudest disaster in the room. And while it does, another warning can begin somewhere else with almost no emotional impact at all. Japan gets a major quake, and immediately the planet understands the stakes. People know Japan lives under constant seismic tension. They know its cities are built with earthquakes in mind. They know the word tsunami is never far away when the seafloor moves there. So when southern Japan shook in late July, the reaction was instant. Reports described a strong quake near Kumamoto on Kyushu. The Japan Meteorological Agency initially gave it a preliminary magnitude of 7.1 before outside agencies later revised measurements, and a tsunami advisory was issued before being lifted. Rescue crews moved, roads were damaged, buildings were hit, and fatalities and injuries began to climb as the hours passed. In those first moments, the entire narrative was centered on one place. Japan was the story. Japan deserved to be the story. But it was not the only story the Pacific was trying to tell. Because while public attention was locked onto Japan's emergency, California had already been shaking through a sequence of events that, taken one by one, can seem easy to minimize, but taken together, start to feel like something you should not casually scroll past. In recent weeks, Northern California was hit by a magnitude 5.6 earthquake near Redwood Valley, an event strong enough that the U.S. Geological Survey estimated around 80,000 people experienced moderate to very strong shaking, while roughly 10 million more felt weak shaking across a much broader region. Shelves rattled, merchandise fell, structures cracked, and for a short time, the old California reality returned in a form everyone in the state instantly recognizes. Then, less than 3 weeks later, Southern California saw a magnitude 4.1 earthquake near Frazier Park. Then, the Bay Area was jolted by a magnitude 4.3 earthquake near Berkeley, the kind of place name that makes people sit upright, because Berkeley is not remote desert emptiness. Berkeley means dense neighborhoods, old structures, transit lines, campuses, infrastructure, and fault country running beneath millions of ordinary lives. On the USGS Aftershock page for that event, the message was simple and unnerving in its own quiet way. Aftershock rates would decrease over time, but they could remain elevated for the following year or longer. Now stop there for a second, because this is where most online videos sprint straight into fantasy. This is usually where someone dramatically declares that Japan's earthquake triggered California, or that the Ring of Fire is lighting up in some synchronized doomsday sequence, or that scientists are secretly terrified of an unstoppable chain reaction already underway beneath the Pacific. But that is not the honest version of this story, and the honest version is actually more interesting. Japan's major earthquakes and California's earthquakes do not need to be directly linked in some simplistic domino effect for this moment to matter. Japan sits on a subduction system where one tectonic plate dives beneath another. California is dominated by a different style of tectonic motion, especially transform faulting along systems like the San Andreas, where plates grind past each other sideways. These are not interchangeable mechanisms, and scientists do not simply look at one large quake in Japan and conclude that California must therefore rupture next. Real Earth science is more precise than that, and if you want people to trust your story all the way through, you have to respect that precision. But precision does not make the pattern comforting. In some ways, it makes it less comforting, because it removes the easy Hollywood logic and leaves behind something more realistic. Two heavily stressed parts of the Pacific world can be unsettled at the same time without one theatrically causing the other. California does not need Japan to give it permission to shake. It was already built for this. It already lives on accumulated strain. It already carries faults capable of producing destructive earthquakes. So the question is not whether Japan triggered California. The question is why California's own movement barely registered emotionally at the exact moment global attention was most saturated by another seismic disaster. That is where the title earns its weight. While the world watched Japan, California started shaking. Not because one instantly caused the other, but because danger does not wait its turn for the news cycle. And this is exactly how seismic complacency grows, not from ignorance, but from comparison. A 7+ earthquake in Japan with tsunami alerts and collapsed structures will naturally overshadow a 5.6 in Northern California, a 4.1 in Southern California, and a 4.3 in the Bay Area. One feels like global breaking news, the others feel local, almost routine, especially in a state that has woven earthquake awareness into its cultural identity. Californians joke about tremors the way people in other places joke about bad weather. If the shaking stops quickly and the damage stays limited, life tends to absorb it and move on. But geology does not care how normalized your risk feels. The crust does not become safer because people have learned to treat the movement as familiar. In fact, familiarity may be one of the most dangerous filters in the entire story, because